Welcome to the second video in the breeding and selection series for ANSC 272. We're going to talk about a basic review of genetics in this video. And so we need to think to our cellular structure, and in the nucleus of the cell we have the DNA. We have a bunch of chromosomes that are made up of the DNA sequence, and that a certain sequence along that strand represents a gene. And on those genes at a certain location are alleles. And alleles are what program the DNA to recognize a trait or not. In the example on the slide, I could find a plant science example easier than an animal science. But at this one loci, you'll notice we have alleles for either a dominant trait of yellow seeds or a recessive trait for green seeds. And so one is coming from the maternal side, one is coming from the paternal side, and that's what programs what we're going to see in the offspring. So, for example, if we had some parent cells and they each had 6 chromosomes, which makes 3 pair, the chromosomes are paired and ready for sperm and egg production. They align, and one chromosome is going to go into each of the cells, so that when we get fertilization, we're back to the 6 chromosomes in our example, or 3 pair. And so that's where, as we're selecting for livestock with certain traits, the more we can get consistent with our genetics and have those passed on from generation to generation, that helps us have consistent genetics within our flock and our offspring. Some alleles can express complete dominance or recessiveness, meaning, or express dominance and recessiveness, like color can sometimes be a recessive trait. Many alleles can have complete or partial dominance, meaning that they're either completely dominant or they may be partially dominant. An excellent example is the alleles that control whether an animal has horns or is scurred, which means the little horny-like substances that are at the top of the skull that looks like they could have developed into horns, but they don't, or is polled, meaning it has no horns. And so that is a partial dominance, and you get all shades in between expressed in the animal. And alleles can also be expressed at one loci that influences the expression of alleles at another loci. And that is epistasis, and fleece color is a great example, where there's multiple locations along the chromosome that affect what's being presented in the actual offspring. And so I have a couple of examples that are important in the sheep industry, just as we're considering understanding how alleles and those play a role for certain traits. There's a genetic defect in sheep called spider syndrome, and sometimes it's expressed with N's or S's. I've seen it both ways, but it's most common in the meat breeds, especially the blackface breeds like Suffolks primarily, and Hamps, and now it's kind of can potentially show up in some of the other breeds. It's not as predominant as was, because once we identified the challenges with this, where it came out was probably back in the 80s or so, and we were selecting animals to be taller and longer and bigger. And so this spider gene actually really, those animals that were potentially carriers of it were really tall and long, but what we didn't realize that there was a hidden recessive gene in there that creates major skeletal problems, and the animals don't do well. And so if we were to take alleles from each parent, and if they were dominant from both sides, we would have a healthy, normal lamb. But then if one of them happened to provide the recessive for spider, and we would have where that's not being expressed in any way, and the lamb looks normal, but it actually carries the spider syndrome gene. But where the problem was when we did have both recessive genes present in an animal, we would see a spider situation. And notice the severe leg deformities and those types of things. That is a problem. So not until we had several generations did we realize this was a problem. And so this is something we can genetically test for. In fact, we try to genetically test the rams that come in, and we have most of our flock tested if they carry the spider syndrome gene or not. So that's something that we do monitor because we just want to make sure we don't ever have to deal with it and gets it off of our plate. But this is a practical situation that understanding genetics helps you out. A second example is in our Southdown sheep. There is a genetic defect that affects the ectodermal layer in the embryo. And these lambs have fine straight hair instead of wool. They're thinner skinned, and sometimes the skin can actually split, and they generally die within a few days to a couple of weeks. And it's a big issue, and we know that it's present in the Southdown breed. And so the breed association has strict guidelines on managing ectodermal dysplasia or hairy lamb syndrome. And so you can test if your sheep are free of the gene or if they carry that recessive gene for hairy lamb syndrome. We do have some carriers within our flock, but with the Southdown rams, we try to make sure that our rams are free of this gene so that we will never have it expressed in our flock. So those are a couple practical examples of where understanding genetics and understanding that there's tools for producers to make production decisions just even on something simple like this to keep certain recessive problem genes out of their flock. There's some terminology that we need to understand when we talk about selection. The first is the difference between qualitative and quantitative traits. The qualitative traits refer to the quality of the animal from the standpoint of non-genetic or environmental factors. These really don't have a huge influence on phenotype. For example, they either have inverted eyelids or they don't. They're programmed for a fleece color. They're either going to have horns polled or be scurred. Something like that. It's not so much environment, like how much you feed them is not going to change the fleece color of a sheep. Same with inverted eyelids. You can't feed that out of them. The quantitative traits refer to quantity or how much. These are generally going to be continuous variables, meaning they're going to be influenced by the non-genetic and environmental factors. Growth rates, fleece weights, reproductive rates, etc. So I can manage my animals to increase their growth rate. I can influence their fleece weight. We can influence reproductive rates. So those are the quantitative traits, and those are the ones that are generally considered of economic importance because they're the ones that we can influence and try to maximize, or actually probably optimize, our flock's traits. The next two terms are phenotype and genotype. We hear these, but understanding what that truly means. The phenotype is the appearance of the animal or the measured performance of an animal. Like it's either how the animal looks or if we have lambs and we measure weaning weight. That's a phenotype. That's how it's expressed. Now, it is expressed as an equation, and I do expect you to know this equation because it's a foundation principle for animal breeding. It's where phenotype is equal to whatever the average of the flock plus the breeding value plus the environment. So phenotype is basically the results of genotype plus the environment. And so when you think about it, that makes sense, is that whatever the animals have genetically and then however we manage them in our environment is going to shape who they are and how they express those factors. So the genotype is all the possible genetic combinations, and it's what we can't see. That's what the DNA is for and is programming these animals to be. So understand that phenotype is the physical appearance or the physical performance of an animal, and it's a function of the genetics and the environment, and the genotype is the actual genetic makeup of the animal. Heritability. Understanding that this is the proportion of the differences among animals for performance traits. And this is due to the differences in these additive effects of the alleles that they have. And so this is where knowing what traits are highly heritable, meaning they're going to be more likely to be passed on from generation to generation. The more highly heritable traits, you can make genetic progress a whole lot faster than you can with the lowly heritable traits, just because it takes time. And so I'm using table 11 out of the textbook, and let's look at some of these key traits. We're going to pick up with those key traits in the next slide just to start that discussion, but refer to table 11 out of that textbook.